Welcome to the Susan LoPresti Wellness Mind, Body, and Soul podcast, the go-to space for midlife and mature women who are ready to reclaim their health, boost their energy, and live long, vibrant, purposeful lives. Each week, we dive deep into natural wellness, holistic healing, anti-aging strategies, and healthy lifestyle habits to help you feel your best physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Whether you're navigating menopause, working through chronic conditions, or simply wanting to age gracefully and intentionally, this show is your sanctuary for science backed insights, powerful stories, and soul nourishing inspiration. So, if you're a woman over 40 or 50 or older looking to thrive in the next chapter of your life, you're in the right place. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Theresa Lyons, a Yale-trained scientist and the founder of Navigating Autism. Theresa has dedicated her career to helping parents of autistic children move from confusion to clarity using science-driven, practical, and compassionate strategies. With new research showing that 37% of children with autism actually lose their diagnosis, Theresa brings a message of hope and possibility that so many families desperately need. She understands firsthand how women and caregivers are navigating the overwhelming information while trying to do what's best for their children. Theresa's community of more than 15,000 parents and practitioners turns to her for guidance that cuts through the noise. Her mission is simple but powerful to eliminate overwhelm and empower families with clear, actionable knowledge rooted in science and free from fear. Her work aligns beautifully with my podcast, which focuses on root causes, holistic well being, and helping families make confident, informed decisions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Theresa Lyons to the show. Dr. Lyons, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you coming on, and I'm very excited about this conversation because my audience is midlife women and older. So they're probably grandparents of children that have autism. And this is a great way for my audience to learn a little bit more about autism and share it with the parents of these children as well. Dr. Lyons, thank you so much for joining today. Excuse me. I appreciate you coming on, and I'm really excited about this conversation that we're going to have.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me here.
You're welcome. So, you're a Yale-trained scientist who's chose to dedicate your life to helping families navigate autism. What led you into this very specific and meaningful field?
My daughter. So this certainly wasn't a plan of mine. I was working in the pharmaceutical industry first as R&D scientist and then as a medical strategist and consulting to the pharmaceutical industry. And when my daughter was diagnosed with autism, that just had me stop everything. And when I asked the doctors, okay, well, what do we do? There really wasn't that good of an answer. And so I stopped working and was able to leverage all of the skills that I learned in school from getting my PhD and working in the pharmaceutical industry to helping my daughter. And then as she started to improve, it was the doctors that we were seeing that encouraged me to get out and teach and write a book and all of that.
How old is your daughter now?
She's 15.
Okay. So, what was it that you were doing that helped her to improve?
Well, it's really about understanding the cutting edge science. So, in the pharmaceutical industry, there's a huge lag between when things are discovered and when they're cutting edge and when they become mainstream practice. And
Hmm.
so that's usually 20 to 30 years. So I wasn't willing to wait that long for meaningful change for my daughter. So the first step was really understanding the science, understanding what exactly is autism. I know what people are telling me, but what in on like the molecular level, chemistry speaking, what is autism? And as I did that research, I found publications all throughout the decades that showed autism was not a permanent, not a lifelong diagnosis for everybody. And that really was the beginning point for me, and understanding, okay, things don't have to be like this for the rest of her life, and they certainly don't have to get worse. And so that was really the jumping off point of trying to understand what is autism.
So tell my audience and me as well, what is autism exactly?
So autism, it's a complex, there's so many things that can be rolled up into an autism diagnosis. So what autism is it's a diagnosis based on observation. And it's typically when so much time has passed that the child is not hitting those developmental milestones.
Okay.
So that is like the medical definition. What is autism? That there's no quantifiable test. There's no urine test or stool test or blood test. So it's something that's based upon observation. So pretty much there are things in this child's life that are preventing them from fully engaging, whether it's speech, so whether they can produce speech or not, or whether they can have a meaningful conversation or not, but something related to speech. And then there's also some kind of repetitiveness that also impacts life. So the diagnosis is made when a child really can't participate in life the way they want to or the way others do. And that's what it is, that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
But then the latest research shows in 2023 that 37% of kids with autism lose their diagnosis, meaning they go on to have a full life. They don't need speech therapy, they don't need PT or OT or, all of these different supports that we typically associate autism with. So there is this growing number now. So back when my daughter was diagnosed, it was about 10% of kids lost the autism diagnosis because their parents, really focused on health. How do we optimize health? What is actually causing these observables? And back then it was called an optimal outcome. When someone lost their diagnosis, it's an optimal outcome. They go on with their life, right? Now, autism in the literature is being classified as non-persistent autism and autism. So there's a change in the terminology that's used,
Yeah.
and it's really important for parents to understand that autism does not have to be a lifelong diagnosis for their child.
At what age do you start to notice that the child is not developing? Like, what are the signs? And at what age, how young are they when you notice that?
Sure, a lot of parents notice things even when they're infants at
Oh,
times,
really?
and it really depends on the course of the child's life. So sometimes you can notice things, when they're 2, 3, 4 months old, right? There's an interaction, there's a cooing, there, even though a baby isn't speaking, right, there is communication back and forth. So you can start to notice those. When a child gets older, they might not respond to their name. So if you call them, they're just looking around. So those are some of the telltale signs.
Mhm.
A reliable diagnosis can be made at 18 months, but the average age of diagnosis is around 4 years. And that's just because there's long wait lists. So to actually get a diagnosis from a reputable doctor, there's typically wait lists, sometimes even a year wait list.
Wow.
Yeah. And then sometimes this used to happen a lot earlier, like back when my daughter was diagnosed, they would say, well, let's wait and see, or let's try and eliminate these other things, right? So things that actually had tests. So you can do a variety of different hearing tests, right? So if you're calling their name and the child's not looking at you, right, it could be autism, right? But again, that's just based on observation. So a lot of doctors say, you know what, let's do a hearing test, and maybe let's do an MRI. And so there's all these other things to try and rule out autism
Hmm.
that do take up time. So for a variety of reasons, diagnoses are usually made much later than it needs to be.
Now, do you know what would bring on autism? Is it the environment that we're in today, the foods? What brings it on? Because I know that when I was growing up, I never even heard of autism. None of the kids in my class were autistic.
Yeah, so the prevalence is there's many different ways to look at that question. So first off, our educational system wasn't integrated, even really back in the day when I was in school, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of the kids that were in special ed, they came in through the back door, they were on separate buses. So
Yes.
many times we have this feeling like there were no special needs kids when we were younger. It's just there really wasn't that much of an integration. So that's one thing. And
Okay.
then there's no scientific publication that talks about the actual cause of autism. So that whole part is still debated. And the reason is because there are so many potential causes. It's not the same for each child. And the other thing to really start looking at then is, okay, what are the things that increase risk for autism diagnosis? Because that's where parents can start to think, okay, was my child, exposed to that risk, right? And so we could talk about air pollution. You brought up the environment. So with air pollution, there's many different studies over the years, and we could talk about particulate matter 2.5. So very, very small fine particles that when you can't see them with your eye, you breathe them in. Not only do they go into your lungs, but then they can enter the bloodstream. And for a pregnant woman, then it can also cross the placenta and then expose the baby to air pollution, this particular small air pollution. And when the woman is in their third trimester, exposure to this type of air pollution increases the risk of autism 30%, which is pretty significant.
Yeah.
And so there are different studies that can quantify increase in risks. So that's one thing. Now, when the child is in the first year or two of life, that exposure to that same level of air pollution would then increase the risk to 60%.
Oh,
So there are all these different things in our environment and genetics that can increase the risk. And this is where it gets very individualized, right? So let's say we have two kids who are 1 year old each. One has a genetic, let's say, complication with detoxification. There might be some changes in their genetic data, and it makes detoxification hard. So
mm,
both those children, and let's say a second one, does not have any issues with detoxing. So you have one child who has a genetic predisposition to issues with detoxing, and you have another who does not. And you expose them to the same environment. So that increase in risk would be 60% for each of those children.
hmm.
But the one with the genetic complication, that now has a very different risk profile than the child who doesn't have any genetic issues related to detoxing. And so this is how genes and environment really interplay that
Yeah.
make it very difficult. And now let's say both of those children got an autism diagnosis. When parents are trying to say, okay, what's going on with their health? Do they have optimal health? The first parents, they might do some type of environmental toxin test, right? And maybe something comes back elevated because that child also has issues with detoxing, right? So then the parents would say, okay, we really need to focus on detoxing. Whereas let's say for the child who doesn't have any of those genetic complications, maybe the parents do something like a simple vitamin D test and they see there's vitamin D deficiency. And so that might be what the beginning focus would be. So they might not have an issue with toxins because genetically they've been able to keep up. So
Right.
this is where autism gets very complex. And I don't think there'll ever be one single cause that can explain all of autism, just because our bodies are so different, and the environment and gene combination really is what parents need to look at to get answers for their child.
Now, my audience is a midlife woman. Probably the majority of my listeners are in their 50s, 60s, and probably older than that. So when they were having children, I think back then it really wasn't prevalent at all. But today it's so much more prevalent.
It
And a
is.
lot of these women that are listening may be grandparents to children who have autism. I think it's important for them to understand what it's all about and how they can help even with their children who the parents of these children. How can they help? How could they support their kids raising an autistic child?
So many ways. So the
Okay.
the first one would be, to have a conversation with their child, and to gauge how they could be helpful.
Yeah.
Because it's always good to know what the other person really needs and appreciates, even though we might think, okay, I want to be helpful. I'm gonna, do XYZ, right? And maybe that's not really what their child needs. So the first step would really to be to have that conversation. And it could be, something so simple as, when I was raising you, uh, it was more straightforward. And I know when you're raising your child with autism, things are more complex, right? That's a very general statement. You don't have to get into details as to what the complexity is.
Right.
Just acknowledging that this is different than when I parented you. And you're going through something that is much more complex.
Yes.
So, really, just starting out that conversation very neutral and trying to be as understanding without forcing on pity, right, to the
Yeah.
person as well. So, and then it could be something so simple as, I really would like to help you. Could you tell me one or two things that I could do that would really be helpful for you? And
Right.
then you could just leave it like that. And then this way, they don't feel like, sometimes we as kids, we think our parents think we don't know what we're doing. And, just
Right.
it can kind of get very complicated, right?
Yes.
So having that kind of neutral conversation first to begin with is really the best way to start. And then you can keep the dialogue going and going. But it's important to understand. So I'll talk about some other research,
Yeah.
publication research on. So that talking about increased risk. So there's new research that is showing that parents whose children are in their teenage years, who these children were diagnosed with autism and emotional dysregulation, there's an increased risk of about 30% of parents to be diagnosed with PTSD from just the whole experience of
Oh,
raising that child with autism.
I could see that.
Yeah, and so it's a very real situation. So involving grandparents and aunts and uncles and extended family would definitely benefit not only the child, but the parent that's raising the child, just because there is so much stress. So that's why it's important to have that conversation with the adult child, and just acknowledging the difficulty of the situation, acknowledging that the grandparent has not been through it, so they're not there to tell them what to do or what's right or what's wrong,
Mhm.
but just letting them know that there is support, because it's needed. Autism is very stressful, and if parents don't take care of themselves, then having a PTSD diagnosis, the literature is showing, is something that does occur more and more when the child has autism and emotional dysregulation.
Yeah. Dr. Lyons, what about diet? for a child with autism? Like, would you try to stay away from all of the cereals with the dyes and like,
Yes.
and that must be very difficult because children, they see commercials and, and their friends eating all this, I call it junk food, but would you recommend that that parents really try to stay away from that kind of food with their child?
Yeah, so diet is huge in health overall.
Yeah.
So we can talk about diet for the child, but since your demographic is a little different, it also is important for the parent and the grandparent. So you've got to be as healthy and as fit and as capable as possible. So, diet changes for the child with autism, very important. I can tell you, I changed my diet drastically. And I'm so glad I did because I'm actually in your demographic. I will be turning 50 soon. So
I wouldn't have guessed that.
I
But
am in
I
your
won't tell
demographic.
anyone. I won't tell anyone.
No problem. But so diet is important for children with autism. And so
Yeah.
we can get into the science of diet. So one of the first things parents start to consider is going gluten-free. And they
Okay.
hear it on social media, and there's a lot of different scientific publications showing there is benefit. Now, the benefit isn't the same for everyone. So the way to understand it is the mechanism of action for gluten is when you eat the gluten, it goes into your small intestines where it is ending up, and then through a few different chemical reactions, a molecule is produced that opens up things in our body. So it's like this, key, right? And so it makes our gut more permeable. So there's more space in between those cells that allow larger items through. So that might be undigested food. It could be different bacteria, different viruses that are normally remaining in the gut. But when you're eating gluten, the mechanism of action is the same for everybody, autism or not, that our gut becomes
Yeah.
more permeable.
Yeah.
And then the immune system has to kick on to clean it up, right? And if we go back to that example of two children with autism, one with a genetic complication with detoxification and one not, the immune system is going to be getting worn down for the child who is continuing to be exposed to pollution and who has genetic difficulties with detoxing. And if you add gluten then to that mix, right, now you've just made the body have to work even more hard, right,
Yeah.
to clean up everything. So this is another reason why when parents make diet changes, some parents will be like, oh my gosh, it was night and day for my child. Things just changed dramatically. And then you'll have other parents who say, I didn't really see too much, right? And if for the parents who didn't really see too much, the first question is, gluten, you have to stay away from gluten for like 6 weeks, really, to see anything. It's one of those things where you have to remove from your diet for quite a while
Yes.
before you even have a chance of seeing anything to change from that. So the question always is, all right, did you do it 100%, and did you do it long enough to see any benefit? And if there's not really any benefit changed, then it gives you insight, okay, maybe immune system isn't involved so much in that child. It could be something else. So this is the reason why changing diet is important, right? Because we don't want to eat food that causes inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
Inflammation is not good for anybody,
Anyone.
right?
Right.
So even like me, when I was, after a while, I was like, all right, fine, I'm just gonna go gluten-free, because I actually accidentally went gluten-free just because I had eliminated everything in the house. And then when I went back and ate gluten, I got a massive headache and I didn't feel good. And so for me, I was like, wow, I feel so much better when I'm
Yes.
eating cleaner, when I'm not having gluten. And I need as much energy as possible for my daughter.
Yeah.
This is a complicated situation. This is not the time to be,
Right.
swinging my emotions with cupcakes. And even today when I eat gluten, the next day I feel it in my fingers.
Yes. I have
I,
celiac disease, so
ah,
I know what you're talking about. And for me, it actually took 6 months to
ah.
feel better.
And that's the important thing to understand about diet, that sometimes we just don't give it enough time.
Yes.
Yeah, and so but this is how things can be so complicated,
Yeah.
and you having family to help around is welcomed. It
Yes.
definitely.
Yes. And lately, because I know with children, they go to birthday parties and they're in school and kids are eating cupcakes and whatever else. And it's so hard because they can't. But more and more, you find so many gluten-free options and so
Oh,
many things.
yes.
So I was diagnosed like 15 years ago
Mm,
when I was
that's
in
very
my
different.
early 40s. And, oh no, I can't eat that. I have celiac disease. What? Like people would look at me, what the hell is that? And it has to be gluten free. And going to a restaurant was practically impossible to
Yeah,
do. But these days, it's so much easier. It's so much
yeah.
more well known at this point.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's well known, again, because the mechanism of action is the same for everybody,
yeah,
right? So this is why some oncologists say, okay, your body's going through a lot, whether you're doing chemo or radiation. So there is always a diet aspect, and many doctors recommend for multiple different therapeutic areas going gluten-free just because you don't want to put that extra burden on the immune system.
right. What I also noticed, Dr. Lyons, with me was I know I was in perimenopause at that point anyway, but I was extremely forgetful. I was working at the time and I'd go into my boss's office and she'd say, I want you to do this, that, and the other thing. And I'd say, okay. And I'd walk out of the office and say to myself, what did she want? Like it totally went out of my brain. And
Yeah.
I was saying I think I'm a little too young for Alzheimer's at this point, but when I eliminated gluten, my thinking became clearer. And
Yes. And you
so,
want to know why?
because my
Because
gut, right? My
it was your
gut was,
gut. But no, no, no. Our central nervous system has those same receptors of protection that the gut has. So when the gut becomes more permeable, then everything in our body can become more permeable. Our brain, our central nervous system. So
yeah,
this is why some parents who do have their children go gluten-free see changes in cognition, see changes in being able to focus. It's because you're maintaining that integrity of the blood-brain barrier.
yeah,
And so from working in the pharmaceutical industry, there used to be clinical trials in which to deliver oncology brain medicine, they were trying to come up with a molecule that was mimicking this downstream gluten, where because the pharmaceutical industry knew, okay, this makes the brain more permeable. Gluten does. So how can we use that? Because getting oncology drugs delivered to the brain is difficult, right? Because the brain is so protected.
yeah,
And so the pharmaceutical industry was actually trying to develop a brain cancer drug that was mimicking some of the aspects of gluten because it
gluten.
would get entry into the brain.
Wow.
Yeah.
So for the children that you've seen that have improved tremendously, has diet played a very important role in that
Diet.
improvement?
Yeah, so I've seen and worked with parents who have been very resistant to diet. I will say, when you create synergy, right? So when you understand what are the health issues with that child, and then how do I make sure I'm not adding to that? And diet is one of those components. So when you have all of that working together, the rate of change is much faster than someone who's like, you know what, I'm still going to let my child eat, lots of sugar and junk food. And it just puts this extra burden on the body.
Yeah.
So having that change in diet is really important. And I would say it's important for the child, but also for the parent.
Yes.
From my experience, it really is. It's just do it for the whole family.
Yeah,
Start changing the diet and having different things. And like you said, you can still have cereal, but it doesn't have to have like 20 grams of sugar. It
right.
could have like 6, which is reasonable. So the child still gets, something fun and tasty and maybe chocolate looking, but it's not gonna, really set them up for a poor day at school.
Yeah. I think the younger the child is when you start this change, the easier it is because it's all they really know. And they,
Yes.
right? So to have a child who is autistic and you decide when they're 15 years old, let's change his diet and see what good luck with that.
It's good. There's gonna be more resistance. Yes,
Yes,
definitely.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what else, for anyone listening on here, what else helps a child with autism to improve in some way? Physical activity, is that important? Or in getting
Oh,
involved in
definitely.
sports?
Yep, physical activity is important for, again, both the child and the parent and the grandparents, right? So it can be kind of a family thing,
Yeah.
exercise and activities. Really starting to use science to understand the child's health. So involving functional or integrative medicine so that you can start to understand what are the actual barriers to this child having the life that they actually want. We see so many of our kids with autism, standing on the sidelines and, watching kids playing sports
Yeah.
or, watching kids be on the debate team or choir or doing all these things. So when you start to understand what is important for my child and what is that barrier, and that's that first step of really understanding the child's health and then figuring out what will work for them. And that's the important part for parents to understand, is to really identify, what are the top 3 issues that it could be sleep, it could be speech, it could be potty training. Like there's so many things, but if you identify 3 and really focus on resolving them, that's the best way to go at this, because it is so complex and there's so many things to keep track of and so many possibilities that there has to be some type of organization.
Yeah. And so you mentioned vitamin D as a supplement for
Mhm.
any other supplements that may help?
There's plenty. So vitamin D is one of those basics, and so
Yeah.
that's it's basic because you can go to your general pediatrician, get a blood test, get the number, see there's a deficiency. The change really becomes, conventional medicine usually says like, all right, around 30 would be okay, whereas functional medicine and integrative medicine, they really want the vitamin D number to be around 60 because they're looking at optimal health, not just like, okay, you're doing good, right?
Right.
So you can start where there is that overlap so that it doesn't feel like you're doing anything, completely out of the box. But there's a lot of things like, vitamin B12, right? That's pretty basic, non-controversial. You can start to look at the B vitamins that get into our brain that really work on speech. So President Trump and RFK Jr. made an announcement over a month ago about leucovorin. And so leucovorin has entered the mainstream. It was, so I can just give a summary. So the reason leucovorin is becoming very talked about is for about 70% of kids with autism, they have antibodies in their brain that block the utilization of folate. And folate is, like one of the most critical things a developing child needs in their brain.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of kids who have speech difficulties have these antibodies, so their brain has not been getting enough folate. So there's a test to do. It's called the FRAT test that will measure if there's actually antibodies there or not. And if there are antibodies, then a prescription for leucovorin, which is vitamin B9, is given. And there are kids who go from totally non-speaking to speaking in a
Oh
matter
my
of months.
goodness.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I was thinking omega 3s.
Omega-3s are important for inflammation. They're important for gut health. So that those are one of and they're one of the basics. I will say fish oils is very popular and it's very accurate for the benefits it has. But for getting kids to take fish oil is
Oh,
not
yeah.
is not necessarily the easiest thing. I mean, I take fish oils myself. I take
Yes.
two big capsules. But even me, when I look at them, I'm like, oh, I wish these were smaller.
Well, you know what? I belong to a shopping club called Melaleuca, and they
Ah,
have omega-3s in a drinkable.
oh, yep.
And I don't know if it's as effective as taking the pill, but I have a hard time with those big capsules as well. Like I always feel like I'm going to choke to death. So I do take the drinkable because I feel like it's better than nothing at all.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
they have it made specifically for children as
Kids.
well.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are options, but that's an extra layer of complexity that
Yes.
a parent has to think about. Okay, yes, omega-3s are good, or vitamin D is good, or leucovorin. Maybe they did the frat test and they saw, okay, we have to give leucovorin. How are we there? That comes that next step of how are we going to give it?
Yeah.
And then being consistent about giving these things. This is where grandparents can certainly help out because there might be several different supplements that this child needs to take or different prescriptions. And so it is just a lot more difficult on that child who's raising this child with autism in so many different ways.
Yeah. I worked with a woman who had an autistic child, and she went through a lot. We sat next to each other. So, you sit next to someone every day, 5 days
Yeah.
a week. You know each other's whole life story, and I knew hers. And I had sent her to my functional medicine doctor because I see a functional medicine doctor. And of course, she talked about, food and diet. And this little boy at this point, he was about 12 years old, and
Mhm.
he was a very picky eater. And she said, Susan, it's more stressful than anything trying to get him to eat healthier. And he had these favorite foods like frozen pizza. That's all he wanted to eat. And it was like either I give him that or he starves. So it was a losing battle as far as food. But he was 12. That's why I mentioned earlier the younger that you can start a child on a healthier diet, the easier it must be. But then they have
Yeah.
their friends at school who are eating all this other stuff.
Yeah. Well, one thing with picky eating though is there are different gut infections, and this is why functional medicine is so important. There are different gut infections that can actually cause these cravings, right? That make a child
Oh,
be very picky. So, a common one is candida, right? So
yes.
candida will drive sugar cravings.
Yeah.
And so one thing parents mistake that's commonly made is when they're making diet changes, they say, all right, no cookies, no cakes, stuff like that. But then unfortunately, the child, and it's not really the child, it's the candida who's like, give me my fuel, right?
Yes.
It says, okay, I'll take apples and I'll take a banana and I'll take a peach and a mango and how about a fruit smoothie? And some of those healthy options which we think are healthy, when you look at the amount of sugar, even though it's natural sugar, some of those smoothies can have 40 and 50 grams of sugar.
Yes.
So it's this is why again autism gets very complicated, but you want to use science always to guide your decision making. So for that 12-year-old who was a very picky eater, the question is always, okay, what is causing that? Because more than likely that's not like the essence of the child who is wanting to do that, right?
Right.
So that's not that's that's typically not how we enjoy things. And so when gut health and different gut infections and different aspects to health are really resolved, then it becomes so much easier. I was working with a parent whose child had some gut infections. They were resolved. And then the child didn't need things on his plate to be separated and not touching. And, there used to be a lot of rigidity, not only to what he was eating and what colors and the texture, but also how it was presented on the plate and the
Yeah.
time of the dinner, right? So there was all of this rigidity, which normally gets associated with, oh, okay, that's just autism. Autistic people need, the same schedule. They need the same,
Yeah.
all of this. But
Is
that's
that
really
true? Is that actually true?
not
No.
necessarily, right? So, like in the instance for this child, it was a gut infection that was really driving a lot of that OCD type behavior and an increase in anxiety. So that was one of the things that were really necessary to understand health, right? No, nobody should, autism or not, nobody should be living with different gut infections that
Yeah.
are causing things like this. And again, the autism diagnosis is made just on observation. So that doctor who's giving the diagnosis of autism doesn't really have a good understanding of, okay, what are the underlying biological reasons, and what is the body's chemistry saying that is, where is it needing to be optimized? So this is why it gets complex, but it's
Yeah.
worth
So as you're talking about gut issues and OCD, I have another friend whose son is about 7 or 8, and out of nowhere, he became obsessive. And so it could actually be his gut
It
that
could be. So that you're asking a brilliant question. So sometimes, and I'm going to take a step back from just our autism conversation. Sometimes there are children, and you're talking about the right age.
he's not autistic.
Correct.
Yeah,
He's not autistic, and everything was going fine, it sounds like.
yes,
And then all of a sudden, like almost overnight, he became OCD and very obsessive. And
yes,
yeah. So this is a comorbidity that often is seen with autism, but it doesn't have to be. That's called PANS. So sometimes a strep infection that isn't completely resolved causes a lot of disruption in the immune system for a child. And then that's the cause. So in that instance, that parent would want to go to a functional medicine doctor that specializes in PANS, because when a child is developing fine and then all of a sudden, whoop, it's night and day, it's completely different. A lot of times that's the infection that hasn't been fully resolved, and that's what causes it. So then the parents really need to focus on that infection.
Can you repeat or spell that PANS?
Sure, PANS, PANS. And so
Oh, PANS. Okay.
so what that abbreviates to is pediatric
Hmm.
acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome.
Wow.
So that's, and then there's, so that's the broad set. And
Right.
then PANDAS is when it's specifically caused by the strep infection. So you would want to work with a doctor who is familiar with PANS, because it's this sudden onset, right? And this can happen
Yes.
in a child with autism. So I'm glad you're bringing this up, in the sense that this child you're talking about had no autism. He's
No.
totally fine. And then all of a sudden it's that sudden onset, right? That's the one thing that really separates PANS from autism. And unfortunately, a child with autism who could have all these different complicated health issues get an autism diagnosis, and then at some other point also all of a sudden have this sudden onset of OCD type behavior. So then that would be a comorbidity, right? So that child could technically have an autism diagnosis and a PANS diagnosis. So this is where health gets really specific.
Mhm.
And these things, this is how autism can get even more complicated when other diagnoses are involved. But definitely
Wow.
tell that parent to find a doctor who specializes in PANS, and it can certainly be resolved. So that's the
Wow.
important thing, not to go through life.
Great information. Thank you. Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
So, what would you leave my audience with? Final thoughts.
Final thoughts is it's really helpful to have grandparents' involvement because this is a very stressful situation. And having that first conversation of how can I best help you is really the way to start. So there's no miscommunication as to what's really needed and what grandparents are willing to do and things like that. And really understanding how important health is. So if grandparents are very knowledgeable in functional medicine, that might be something that they offer to help with, is really looking at the chemistry.
Thank you. I also wanted you to touch on the community that you built of 15,000 parents and practitioners. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So I love educating the science of autism, and I love parents to see changes in their children. So again, 37% of kids with autism lose their diagnosis, meaning they go on to have a full life and no barriers to what they want to achieve in life. And to get there, it's a very complicated journey, and it's not something that changes overnight. So we've built a Navigating Autism platform that organizes the information so parents can pick and choose what is relevant to their child. And we have health coaches that really help keep parents motivated because this is a difficult journey. And we also are able to accept flexible spending. So we make this as accessible. It's $98 a month for the guidance. Parents can order functional medicine tests through the platform as
Oh,
well. We do
beautiful.
have grandparents on the platform, so I do love to see grandparents getting involved and being part of the dialogue and really helping their grandchildren have optimal health. And so that's what the Navigating Autism platform
And
is.
where could they find this community?
Sure, if they go to navigatingautism.com. And I do spell autism a little differently.
So
So
can you send me that in the email and then I'll put it in the show notes and any other websites or anything that would help that you could send me, I would appreciate that.
I will do that.
Dr. Lyons, thank you so much for being here. This was such an informative and helpful conversation to let new moms that are going through this know that they're not alone and there is light at the end of the tunnel as well.
Definitely. Yeah.
And I love what you're doing, and I'm so happy that your daughter is thriving. And out
Yeah.
of something not so great, always comes something good, right? So you have a
Yep.
mission, and that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today and for welcoming Dr. Lyons to the show. I hope you walked away with as much clarity, hope, and actionable insight as I did. If you're a parent navigating autism or simply wanting to learn more about science-based, compassionate strategies to support your family, be sure to check out Navigating Autism and connect with Theresa Lyons' community of over 15,000 parents and practitioners. I'll include the links in the show notes so you could dive right in. Remember, moving from overwhelm to clarity is possible, and small informed steps can make a world of difference. If this episode resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who could benefit from this conversation. Until the next time, keep nurturing your mind, body, and soul, and take one step today towards clarity and empowerment. Thank you for listening. Have a beautiful rest of your day.